What does music mean? There's a question for you. From the writings of Pythagoras to the poet T.S. Eliot, the tendency to view music as an analogue for language, a way to compose and express thought, has encircled the art form and raised issues about its nature as an aesthetic and intellectual entity. It has the power to express what words can't, to move a listener more deeply than a spoken appeal to the emotions, maybe holding a greater hold over the senses. It means a lot to countless people, and has done throughout time regardless of changing tastes and fashions, but what precisely is its meaning? In 1908, an American insurance executive called Charles Ives asked this question, which Leonard Bernstein retroactively verbalised as
"Whither music?"
That's academic for where is music going. At the turn of the century, music, like other art forms, began to respond to the conceptual and formal challenge of modernism, in what could perhaps be described as a crisis point for musical tonality. Previously dependable systems of melody and harmony in the intellectualised Western tradition no longer seemed appropriate for musical expression, leading composers like Arnold Schoenberg and his pupils in the Second Viennese School to adopt increasingly rogue, often mathematical practices to destabilise the idea of a tonal centre. This wave of experimentation arguably changed the trajectory of Western music, in at least the first half of the 20th century, influencing to some extent everyone from Bernard Herrmann to Kate Bush. But the deconstruction of tonality and the greater overall reliance on unconventional techniques, whilst providing a direction for music's development, did not resolve the problem of meaning. Charles Ives, the son of an amateur band leader, composer and teacher of music theory, lived a life in which music was a meaningful, if not a central presence. He had balanced college sport with composition, completing his first symphony in his senior year, and several years after graduating, founded an insurance firm, which he was to head for the rest of his working life. In fact, it was only after his death in 1954 that much of his work reached publication and eventually international acclaim. The Unanswered Question, written by Ives in 1908 and continually revised over the next few decades, is a sonic cry out into the void. Ives' enigmatic piece was first performed in 1946 and has echoed throughout the Western musical consciousness ever since. We begin with a sustained, muted and serene G major chord in the strings, eventually gliding slowly and simply through a primary chord sequence that seems to unfurl an expansive and crucially unperturbed canvas. This is our setting, a cosmic landscape as Ives calls it in a subtitle to the piece. The cosmos is a figure that appears throughout much of Ives' work, encapsulated in his unfinished Universe symphony that he embarked upon in the final years of his musical career. From this serenity, known as the Silence of the Druids, then enters the titular Question, a trumpet melody that enters disconcertingly on a lingering B flat. It's with this simple but unsettling dissonance between major and minor that Ives launches the perennial question of existence, a motif that lasts just short of 2 bars. The remaining 3 or so minutes consist of a dialogue between this restless melodic unit and a chorus of dissonant flutes, the fighting answerers. Whose music, unstable, inconsistent, and increasingly imitative of the question it is posed, fails to resolve the simplicity of the trumpet's call. Now, if that doesn't sound like the most pretentious piece of angst-ridden experimental art, then you've found yourself, probably not for the first time, in disagreement with the likes of Leonard Bernstein. Despite naming a lecture series after the composition, Bernstein found the piece as naive as it was mysterious. Nevertheless, it anticipates the explicitly atonal works of Schoenberg, inadvertently serving as a parallel to what would become a momentous musical trend. Ives' piece seems to rely heavily on annotations and prefatory notes, like the programmatic music of Romantic composers such as Hector Berlioz and Richard Strauss, with each portion of the orchestra assigned what are effectively roles in a piece of theatre, alluding to lofty philosophical entities like the authoritative druids who are unable to interpret this grand metaphysical question. Ives suggests that music is a medium of expression, able to pose a question and yet incapable of speaking for itself, hence raising the need for his guiding materials. In this sense, not only is his question unanswered and maybe unanswerable, but perhaps it's even unaskable. Yes, there's a level at which Ives' text questions existence, that most fundamental of queries, but aside from this, it's a question of questioning. What can music ask? This frustration with music as a communicative tool is as palpable as the dissonance of those struggling flutes. It might even be the impossibility of his question that contributed to his decision to drop music altogether in around 1924. Though the questioner may have gone silent, the question Ives unleashed remained unresolved and unsilenced for decades since. That is, until this musical monologue, a call out into the void, received its response. Technologically, music had developed to an almost unrecognisable extent by the time Laurie Spiegel emerged onto the scene. The bold doctrines of Schoenberg and co. eventually subsided, but the fundamental attitude of rebellion against prevailing Western orthodoxy continued to fuel the engines of artistic movements. More and more composers looked to the East, incorporating microtones into their compositions, pitches between conventional intervals, something which Ives' father György had experimented with in the late 19th century, and developing a greater confidence with rhythm. At the forefront of the American avant-garde, of which Ives may be seen as a precursor, was a generation of artists working around New York in the 1960s, who became known for their minimalist style, their pieces often highly repetitive and featuring relatively few instruments. Among peers like Meredith Monk, Terry Riley, Steve Reich and Philip Glass, all of whom flirted with the burgeoning possibilities of electronic instruments, Laurie Spiegel found her place as a pioneer of this new music. Self-trained in string instruments and only learning Western notation at the age of 20, Spiegel received a traditional education in composition like many in the avant-garde. In the mid-1970s, she began working with synthesizers, a term she uses reluctantly, preferring to think of the sounds produced by the Buchla and EML machines as real music made on real instruments, as opposed to something designed to sound like existing instruments. By 1980, she had collected enough material for an album. The Expanding Universe runs at a little over 2.5 hours long, with the eponymous track, a sprawling, glacial blend of electronic sound lasting just shy of 30 minutes. The album forms a musical cosmology suitable to its title, at points aggressively radical, such as the mathematically dictated Kepler's Harmony of the Worlds, written to correspond to a Renaissance work of astronomy that ended up aboard the 1977 Voyager probe, and at other times refreshingly buoyant, as in Music for Dance 1 and 2. But amid the noise, variously tonal and atonal, we get perhaps her most popular piece, if Spotify's 2 million listeners are anything to go by. The Unquestioned Answer is best described as a sedative to the existential anguish of Ives' piece Unquestioned. Based around a single Buchla melody line that elides and bleeds into its various iterations, the piece is the embodiment of the New Age mindset. Optimistic, soothing, and refreshingly elemental, it's a track that could easily go on forever beyond its assigned 6.5 minutes, something that definitely can't be said of the Unanswered Question with its unsettling dissonance. There's no doubt with a title like that Spiegel's work is in direct dialogue with Ives's, just over 70 years its elder. Even their respective dates, 1908 and 1980, are, albeit coincidentally, mirrored. Ironically, Spiegel's answer, beneath the surface serenity, leaves one rather basic question unanswered. What's the tonal key? Built upon a string of ninths, fourths, fifths and sixths, with a central repeated tonic of E flat, never in the piece do we hear the crucial third note, the G or G flat, that would help us determine whether it was in E flat major or minor. We therefore end up in a similar place as with the Unanswered Question, whose layered major and minor tonalities cancel one another out. The tonal centre of the piece, E flat, is unquestioned, and while the true harmony of the piece remains a mystery, our ears are satisfied with this state of ignorance. Her answer is unquestioned, without conflicting counter melodies or threatening dissonance. There's no real sense of anticipation or climax that one would expect from a traditionally structured piece of music. Instead, Ives' fears of inexpression, of meaninglessness, are put to rest, if not indefinitely, then at least for the 7 sublime minutes of Spiegel's answer. In interviews, she stressed the need for human expression in music, acknowledging that others in pursuit of this have tended to value technique over musical content. In the Unquestioned Answer, content is the state of being content, at peace with what we do know and feel, as opposed to reaching for what we don't. So, to return as Charles Ives does to this opening question, what does music mean, or to Bernstein's With a Music? Well, to answer with the words of Laurie Spiegel written on the cover of her album, Music isn't verbal or conceptual, it simply is what it is. And I think that's as satisfying an answer as any.